Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 9th of September 2024. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. And, hopefully all is well with Andy. I just saw a slight flicker on the camera there. Is the internet doing you dirty today, Mr. Brockman?
Put it this way, if I walked to you and delivered this content verbally, it might be quicker than the net's been this afternoon. It's not been very helpful.
No. But hopefully we'll get through and our Watching Brief will continue. It has been a couple of weeks. We've been working on a few sort of housekeeping ideas, and we'll be talking about that in an upcoming sort of brief episode, I think, at the end of this week. Or at some point in the very near future. But today we want to finally turn our attention to two economic reports in particular that were recently published. In particular, the so-called State of the Archaeological Market, published by FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, back at the end of June, I think, or was it July?
It was
July, back at the end of July. This summer, anyway, we saw this report come out, and you may remember I flagged as a talking point one of the things that I found most astonishing from the key sort of headline stats and facts that they were reporting, and that is that the archaeological sector, this isn't the broader heritage sector, but archaeology in particular, this would be commercial archaeology primarily, and developer funded primarily as well, runs at an aggregate profit level of 3.1%, 3% ish or thereabouts. And bearing in mind that compares to between a 20 and a sort of pushing 35% profit margin for the rest of the development sector, and that doesn't count working sort of job a day builders. That is to say, people doing the developing are making a much larger profit to the tune of almost 10 times the amount. It was quite a shock to see that the UK archaeology, supposedly the one of the more healthy parts of the archaeological sector in the United Kingdom, runs at only 3%. Particularly also as well in the context of in recent months, inflation pushing 6 or even 10% at times. This makes me feel as though it makes me feel vulnerable, and I'm not even a developer archaeological unit in that sense. It makes me very very uncomfortable. But this report probably should helpfully be contrasted with the economic value of the heritage sector. This was put out by Historic England, and it's been out for a while. It was last updated on the 1st of December 2023. But it talks about the economic value of the heritage sector as a whole being about £45.1 billion and employing around 538,000 people. That is in contrast to the reported FAME figures for archaeology of 4,851 people, so less than 5,000 people as opposed to 800,000 odd, and a total sector value of £309 million. So again, just to compare, £309 million for archaeology, £45.1 billion for heritage, 538,000 plus workers in the heritage sector, compared to what actually works out at basically 1% of that within archaeology, around 4,851 people. How to quote a certain song that I used to play a lot when I was a mopey teenager, how does this make you feel?
How does it make me feel? I think it makes me feel that the developer-funded archaeology sector should wake up and smell the coffee, to coin another phrase. And to be fair to FAME, the forward by its to the report by its current chair, Tim Malin. Tim Malin is an archaeologist. He's actually a heritage consultant now. His background is in archaeological units and developer-funded archaeology, obviously. But it's a very punchy, 5-paragraph introduction, the key paragraph of which is absolutely damning.
Yeah.
He talks about success rates for tenders being on average 45%, and that's. But I probably should just explain briefly for Avia, who isn't completely familiar with the UK system, or certainly the system in England, and it's very similar in the devolved administrations. But basically, there are a series of commercially operated, although they're mostly educational charities, archaeological units who fund themselves by doing work for developers, which developers are instructed to carry out when they get planning permission under the system of planning consent, which is, broadly speaking, the function of local planning authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a developer. I go to local planning authority and say, I want to build a housing estate on this particular location. And they say, yes, so long as you do this, 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 and this. Oh, and by the way, you've got to have an archaeological investigation. At which point I can go probably through a commercial archaeological consultant, who might also be a member of FAME, and say, okay, find me a contractor who will do this at the best price. And there'll be probably a competitive tendering process, and almost invariably the contracting unit that comes in with the lowest price gets the gig. That's what these people are doing, and that might explain why the profit margins are so low, because basically it's a buyer's market. And
which is interesting, given that I mean, the paragraph that you were just hinting at for the chair's forward there, he says it means the opposite, which I find fascinating. So he says here, another interesting statistic is that the success rate for tendering was on average 45% per tender offered, presumably per bid for work. This result shows that the investment in quoting for archaeological work has a high chance of winning each tender, but also less than half of the time. That's not massively high, which counters, he says, the perception that we operate in a competitive market governed by tight margins. Now, as I say, above that, they're quoting a 3% profit margin and 45% tenders, given that people are bidding against other archaeological units, means that only 4, let's be generous and say maybe 5 out of 10 bids you put forward are being undercut by other archaeological units. Presumably, they're losing based on the cost that they've been quoting.
Almost invariably, yeah.
Yeah. So that sounds to me like a race to the bottom. That sounds like people cannibalizing each other, not as he says, a counter to the perception that we operate in a competitive market governed by tight margins. What? Put
it this way. This has been a criticism of the system since it came in really in the mid 1990s.
Yeah.
With what was then called PPG 16, Policy Plan Guidance 16, which first really put this system into place within the UK, within the English planning system. In the early noughties, I was doing my master's degree, and our summer training dig was on a quarry out in Essex. The reason Birkbeck College Archaeologicals got to do that gig was we were finishing off and cleaning up the mess that had been left behind by a contracting unit that had been doing the work for the gravel company and had basically bailed on it because they realized that they'd underbid by so much they couldn't sustain it.
Yeah.
And walked away. At which point, English Heritage, as it then was, sent up the flares and said, who can bail us out of this one? Because planning consent required the work to be done.
And that was then. This is in the context of, as the chair says at the start here, the highest inflation rates for over 40 years and a largely flatlining economy.
Yeah, and now you can, as I say, this criticism this argument has been going on effectively since the current system came in. This is not new.
No,
and
I'm sorry, I hate to get caught up on it, but how is that statement anything other than delusional?
Well, it is delusional. Well, no, it's not delusional. It's spin, because I could spin the same statement in the same way by saying that archaeological units, the project managers at archaeological units, spend just over half their time bidding for contracts they're never going to win.
Yeah, because their mates down the road are saying, "Oh, we'll do it for a sandwich," you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Now, and fame is an industry body. It advocates for its industry, but I think that there are some things that are so blatantly the case that it can't be spun in a way that is possible. And as I say, the core paragraph of this introduction, in a sense, it's just saying what the data in the rest of the document says. But I'll just quote it for you. It talks about profit levels have dropped significantly to just 3.1%, as you said, as an aggregate level, even though turnover and charge out rates have risen in the same period. And this low statistic has been influenced partly by over a quarter of respondents having made losses. Now, these might be educational charities, most of them, but they are also companies. They have to function on a cash flow basis. And if they have a negative cash flow and they make losses, they can't sustain it forever. Now, recently, for example, for all sorts of reasons, but one of them has to be financial, we've seen a merger of the archaeological units that were operating in Wales into one unit.
Yeah.
Economies of scale, which will also result in redundancies, usually in that kind of, if not immediately in the course of, as duplicate roles are removed. But the Malin talks about charge out rates not reflecting inflation, and that's insane. It implies that companies are so desperate for the work they continue to quote at unviable price levels. Some of them, at least, continue to quote at price levels which aren't viable, simply to keep. It's almost like the shark that has to keep moving or it sinks to the bottom in the old myth.
Well, it's more like a shark that's eating its own tail.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And then again, this is where it comes. And I think we're going to talk about the way the archaeological and heritage economy is divided up. And I would argue we're actually seeing two archaeological and heritage economies in operation in these reports. But Malin also says it's a red warning signal to us all. The industry must address this issue with archaeological businesses recognizing the value they bring to clients, and that they must include a higher level of profit target in their cost estimates. If not, we'll risk not bringing in sufficient surplus for research and development, staff training, or reserves to weather unexpected costs, which would result in market failure and companies going into receivership.
Yeah.
Now, given that archaeology is all meant to be about added benefit to the public, putting an archaeological record in a safe place for future research, preservation by record, preservation of artifacts in an archaeological archive, and that work being done by skilled professionals who are valued as part of sustainable operations that are able to weather things like, for example, the cost of living crisis and the increased energy costs. And we're looking at increased energy costs again this autumn. All these things. The fact that, according to this, the chair of this organization, this representative body for pretty much all of developer-funded archaeology, saying that basically companies are barely charging out enough to keep themselves going at a basic day-to-day functioning level.
Yeah,
that's pretty damning.
It is, and I mean there are two thoughts that come to mind as well off the back of what you've just said. One of those being, an attendant service to archaeology nationally would be things like the Archaeology Data Service. They manage data for the long term. They store it. They try and combat digital decay, but also with that comes cost, or in terms of curation and, as you say, energy costs. The other aspect of that as well is that there's no fat on the horse. There's nothing that's gonna sustain it through, as he says, a hard time. Now he does talk about archaeological, economic headwinds hitting the archaeological sector, and we've weathered it apparently. So maybe this is just a low point before it starts to creep back up again. And there are some positives here. So, for example, staff contracting is reported at being overall 85% of workers in the commercial sector in 2023 were on permanent contracts. This is actually up from the 2022 figure of 81%, so up by 4%. 15% were employed on fixed term contracts. The sector apparently has seen fairly good pay level changes. So rose by above inflation for salary. 50% of people reported, or say 50% of respondents reported salaries having risen above inflation. Rising by inflation, 30%. So that's 80% of the sector at or above inflation for pay. But all of this means if more people are on permanent contracts and more people are being paid at or above inflation, that's eating even more into that profit margin. And the fact that people are rushing not rushing, sorry, they have to be competitive and therefore underbid their competitors to the point where where you're losing 55% of your bids. It's squeaky bum time. It's by the skin of your teeth, isn't it?
I do urge people to look at the FAME report. There's a couple of other statistics that they point up, which could be quite important for the future. And another factor that could also be quite an important negative in the future. Now, for example, they talk about the average turnover per member of staff is just under £64,000 per person. So, and if you look at that turnover in terms of the cost of that person, if you look at archaeological wages, even the highest paid archaeological staff are only on about half that. So, individual staff are turning over much more than it costs to employ them at that most basic level. But obviously, there's all the other overheads and so on that have to eat it. That eat into that, and the things that an archaeological unit does and can charge for, probably not as much as it could do, which is what the implication of Mr. Mallin's comments are. So there's that. It also mentions that residential development was the largest market sector for developer-led archaeology in the year 2022-2023, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
First year properly out of COVID, really. Developer-funded archaeology in the residential market is the biggest money earner. Now, the current government, as we've discussed before on the watching brief, wants to turbo boost the building of housing in the UK in the next 5 years. So that could be a good thing. That could promote employment. That could promote profitability. We don't yet know if at all, how or if at all, developer-funded archaeology is going to be affected by changes to the planning system.
No.
So there's that big question mark. The other big question mark, and again, Mr. Mallin mentions it in his introduction. He talks about the drop in income from transport-based projects. Now, he reckons that reflects the life cycle of HS2. Now, this data covers a period before HS2 North was cancelled and before the Stonehenge A303 tunnel and upgrade with its reported 35 million quid's worth of archaeology was also cancelled. Be interesting to see how next year's report reflects those two factors.
It would. It would. And actually, we should bear what we've just been talking about in mind, because there is an interesting statistic quoted by Historic England here, that I'm wondering how this actually reflects on archaeology and frankly, the representation of archaeological managers and employers nationally. So we'll come back to this sort of that question in a second. But I mean, is it at this point worthwhile comparing it to the economic outlook as reported by Historic England? Do you think?
It probably is.
Broadly speaking, Historic England are uh, relatively positive about outlook. They say that there's been a huge bounce back in recent months and years. That the economic value of the heritage sector. This is in 2021, but this is the report that they put out for 2023. Was estimated at being 45.1 billion, and this actually was described as being a gross value added element. So, in other words, this is not just the value that's left over. This is actually the value that's being generated by heritage across England, sorry, for the English economy. So direct generation 15.4 billion, indirect, so that's supply chain generation 14.8 billion, and then induced, that's wider spending. Presumably that might include things like site tourism and this kind of thing. I'm guessing that'd be was 14.9 billion pounds, with a total value added to the economy of, for every pound spent, £1.93 is returned to the economy. It seems, which is very healthy. It's almost 1 for 1 in terms of cost benefit. The the benefit is, though, heavily weighted towards the south of England. Where I am in the northeast of England, it's one of the least beneficial sectors, broadly speaking. But in the south, and also particularly in London, a massive. London absolutely dominates on the stats there. But curiously here, they talk about the economic footprint of key heritage subsectors. They talk about public administration and defences. So that's £0.74 billion worth of the economy. Architectural and engineering services, that's £2 billion. Libraries, archives and museums, that's 3.2 billion. But the biggest was construction, interestingly. £7.5 billion, 48% of the GVA, the gross value
added, yeah,
comes from construction. And what's interesting there is that they go on to say that the heritage sector is made up of a diverse, dynamic set of subsectors permeating across various industries. The construction industry is the largest single subsector in terms of heritage sector GVA, generating 48.4% of total GVA, or that is £7.5 billion. This is more than double than the next largest industry, libraries, archives, etc., and represented a profitability turnaround of 35% in the past economic activity area, 34.7% rather. Sorry. So, how is it then that archaeology isn't feeling that, in that sense? If so much of the archaeological economic reckoning is based on development, and nationally, construction is 48% of economic value added. What's going on? Why is archaeology running at that meager 3%? A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I mean, we can distill it down to some even more basic figures, really. We're talking about a lot of, apologies to our viewer, we're talking about a lot of different organisations and reporting bodies and campaigning bodies today. Another document, and it's a good précis actually of all of this, is the Heritage Manifesto 2023, which was published by the Heritage Alliance. They also published a more comprehensive Heritage Manifesto for the general election this year in July 2024. But the Heritage Manifesto, the Heritage Alliance is a representative body. Council for British Archaeology is a member of it. It basically campaigns in a non-political way with government to try and influence legislation, whichever government's in power. And to, for example, to make sure that the planning system properly recognises heritage as well as other environmental issues, that kind of thing. The headline of the Heritage Manifesto, and if you look at hierarchy of text, it talks about heritage as the background and bedrock of Britain. It is everywhere and benefits everyone. And again, this is a deliberate attempt to try and gainsay the people who say archaeology is elitist. Why should developers have to pay for it? But anyway, it breathes life into our towns, cities, and coasts and countryside, telling our nation's stories, creating places that people want to live and invest in. Very carefully using that language of economy. Invest. And don't forget, you can invest emotionally and you can invest physically and financially. If properly supported, heritage can pave the way into achieving net zero, regenerating communities, improving our well-being, and powering a green skills revolution. See how it's tick boxing current government aims. So it's actually getting it's saying we aren't above all this. We're not scholars and academics, and we don't want to get down and dirty with all this stuff. We actually are part of this story, and a positive part of this story. But in terms of actual figures, it points out, and I think you mentioned it earlier, but I'll just reiterate it quickly here because it's worth saying, worth reminding our viewer. England's heritage industry, this is England's heritage industry only, produces a gross value added impact of 36.6 billion, which is more than the defence industry. Yeah. It's more successful in bringing money into the economy than the defence industry. It then talks about tourism, and the tourist spend is something like 18 billion just on heritage trips every year. 7 of the UK of Britain's top 10 attractions are museums and heritage sites. Now, again, most of them are in London. It's places like Westminster Abbey, Tower of London, British Museum, but it's still part of the heritage economy. And of course, that 18 billion spent on heritage trips, you add to the spend on other cultural events. They go and see a West End musical. They go out to a restaurant several times while they're here. Yeah, and you can see it rapidly mounts up. And then in terms of the people who matter because it's happening in their communities, they point out 99% of the population lives within a mile of somewhere that's listed under the national list. And polling has indicated that something like 3/4 of respondents say that the government has a moral duty to protect national heritage. So the sector, should be pushing an open door.
Can I just briefly just give a slight devil's advocate question there, in so much as that's all about wording, though, isn't it? So not that long ago, under the Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries, she would have said that she was
sorry. I can't hear the words Culture Secretary and Nadine Dorries without thinking of two things. One is yogurt, and two is the most unimpressive culture secretary I think we've ever had. But anyway, that's another story. She's a very successful novelist.
Dynamite Doris.
Dynamite Doris, yes. Yeah, look up the Dorman Long Tower.
Mm.
And,
she would have made the argument that she was pursuing that moral duty to protect heritage when she blew up the Dorman Long Tower. No, so when she for example, arguably wasted her time making a political point, adding
you're going to talk about statues, aren't you?
Adding a plaque in the context of the Oriel College road statue, or the the obsession with, for example, statuary and that whole culture war thing. So depending on how you word that question, it's kind of like saying, are puppies good? Of course puppies are good. Do you believe that, quote, the government has a moral duty to protect heritage? Well, of course. I mean, like I think it depends on what that heritage is that the respondents will answer in different ways. If they consider, for example, a local
Go on. Sorry, go on. Well, I was going to say, particularly if you ask them, for example, what's more important, affordable homes for young people or preserving a row of Victorian houses?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So that's just something just to be aware of, I guess, in that sense. But the reason why I say this is devil's advocate, I also say that in the context of this being, it's called a heritage manifesto. It's a wish list. It's designed to convince. It's language and a presentation which is designed to turn someone's head, make them think about what the authors want them to think about.
The Heritage Manifesto is deliberately designed. It's an advocacy document for its member organisations and their individual members who might be wanting to, lobby what was a prospective parliamentary candidate, what is now their MP.
Yeah,
it's it's to say, please, Mr. MP, support legislation to embed such and such a heritage principle in planning.
Yeah,
that's what it's for.
Yeah,
absolutely. Or actually, more to the point now. Please, Mr. Ms. they MP, please don't vote for any legislation which dilutes heritage and environmental protection in the planning system. That's what the debate is going to be about.
Yeah, absolutely. And although thankfully so far we haven't seen clear signals that the current government, as you were saying, are going to go down a route of egregious reform, but we'll keep an eye on that, obviously.
Absolutely.
This document talks about, again, it's a wish list, reforming tax regimes to incentivize repair to historic structures, embedding the historic environment in climate action. I know that's one of your go-to causes, if not your number one cause, I think.
No. Actually, my number one cause is that one you alluded to just before, and that is repair and redevelopment. One of the biggest problems facing the sector at the moment, particularly for important but not listed buildings, is the idea that a developer can do a development more cheaply by demolishing and rebuilding because of favourable VAT rates than upgrading and retrofitting an existing building.
Yeah.
Architects Journal, we've talked about it before, has a campaign called Retrofit First, and one of the demands of that is that government levels the playing field by making it no more expensive to retrofit than to rebuild. And in fact, in environmental terms, retrofitting is almost invariably environmentally more friendly because of the carbon footprint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're not releasing that, and you're also as well not having to generate more particularly, for example, with concrete production, this kind of thing.
Exactly.
Regardless, though, one of your top issues is considering heritage and environment as not just the historic environment and the natural environment, but rather the environment together in general. They talk about harnessing cultural and learning skills, encouraging youth visits to heritage sites and curriculum, subsidised entries, implementing cross-subsidised shared apprenticeship schemes, and so on and so forth. But also as well, and this is where we sort of come full circle, future-proofing heritage at every level.
Yeah.
They suggest that it should be a goal to ensure the adequate funding and continued stability of arm's-length heritage bodies, protecting the 20% share of lottery funding for the National Lottery Heritage Fund, supporting statutory historic environment records, which is a very good idea, with ring-fenced investing in local authorities for heritage expertise, and supporting proposals for a national centre for archaeological archives, which actually, funnily enough, connects back to my point about the Archaeological Data Service. In fact, this is being identified as as a key thing. The archiving, again, future proofing. Is there a way? Is there a way, given that we reserve our questions for fame for very special occasions, don't we? Because we've had interactions with them where they've been less than eager to hear back from us in terms of questions. So
I'm sorry. I'm yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. You're right. I'm not going to be provoked.
Then
I'm not going to bite.
No. Long story short, dear reader, we've been told that if we ask any question that's all of them, then they'll get the police involved. Now that was a while ago. Things.
And then a member of the management of fame.
Yeah. Just the management. It's just the management of the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers. But anyway, given that we don't want to bother them, I have a question that we can talk about amongst ourselves, and that is, what can and could and should be FAME's response to this, instead of just sort of flipping the script and describing what is a race to the bottom as, well, less than half the time people win their tenders, and ignoring what this implies. How can this be plugged into what we've just been describing, which is a relative time of recovery? In fact, the the construction sector specifically in 2021 saw a 32.5% swing turnaround in annual growth. And that seemingly has maintained fairly healthily, even though there's been a slight economic slowdown. How it's not bounty, but it's more livable than running at 3%. How can archaeology advocate for itself and advocate for the need for, as the Heritage Manifesto from the Heritage Alliance points out, future proofing in a way that doesn't risk seemingly doing what FAME don't want to do, and that is, I suppose, risk annoying developers, and therefore potentially risk those developers lobbying government to remove archaeological protections and process from development. So in that sense, I understand reticence, but how can we get closer to having a bit more of the pie? Because people are, well, as we said, people are starving out there in that sense. The shark is eating its own tail. What do you think?
I think it's very difficult. I think I'm reading all these reports in preparation for this afternoon, this discussion this afternoon. One of the things that struck me most is that actually we have at least two, if not more, separate heritage economies, certainly in terms of archaeology. Going back to the FAME document, and again, FAME don't like us maybe for asking certain questions at one stage, but we continue to do them the credit of treating them as a serious player with serious things to say. And this is a serious report with some very interesting and very important data in it. And one of the most striking charts, lists of figures that I'd just finish off by drawing our attention to is a chart of turnover for the sector for that particular year, 22-23. And it talks about sources of the money going into the sector that's turned over by all those units. Now, the total is just over £119 million. Sounds like a lot of money. Of that, 86%, 102, just over £102 million comes from private sector developer clients.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
National heritage bodies like Historic England, Cadw, Historic Environment Scotland, 3%, just over £3 million. Central government, about £5 million, 5%. Local district councils, just over 4 million, another 3%. Other public bodies, including universities, public and private partnerships, and local enterprise partnerships, 2%, just over £2 million. And this is where it gets me. Community groups, the kind of stuff that has been talked about by the Heritage Alliances, for developing communities, climate change, well-being, all those things. Those commercial units are only turning over just over 1%, around 1% of the turnover for the entire sector. It's less than 1.5 million. And I think that is interesting. I think it's also worrying because it shows a developer funded sector that could be seen, I'm not saying it is, but could be seen as largely disconnected from all those other community goods. What they're doing, in effect, is ticking boxes for developers, writing the grey literature reports, and that end up in the Archaeological Data Service archive.
Yeah, or the historic
And
record.
that's as far as it goes, because the developers, apart from a few very enlightened ones, or where they're told they have to, don't want to go any further. They don't want to engage with communities. They separate out the placemaking and so on. And in fact, when it comes to placemaking, most of them are, it's the old story about the Section 106 agreement to build a school and a dentist, and then halfway through the development, they say, "Oh, unfavourable economic conditions. Can we duck out of the Section 106?" That's how developers work, or at least many developers work. I can't say all of them. And cut to the chase. In a sense, we've got an archaeological sector, I think this data and these reports show, running on two separate tracks. Whether it's sustainable to keep running on those two separate tracks, or whether they actually need to be brought back together to form one train again, I think that's the question the sector has to ask itself.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about the Section 106 there, with the developer being able to turn around and say, "Oh, unfavourable economic conditions, can we back out of the community obligation that we signed up to?"
Yeah.
Do you know why they do that? They do that because they have to maintain their profits.
Of course they do. Yeah,
but
exactly.
that's the thing, isn't it? That's at the heart of the philosophy of running the development. But somehow the archaeological sector, the archaeological development funded sector, is being encouraged to skim along the bottom, and as I say, run at about 3.1%, because, well, you can always take a bit more off. You can always underbid people. You can always do that for less, can't you? But if the people running the development were told to eat into their profits, no, they cut something from the project.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's I think this is so. I know I was a bit glib about FAME a little earlier, and I'll continue to point out how strange they are at times, because I think it's important until things are done sensibly that we acknowledge that things are strange. But I would really love to see this Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers advocating for that simple economic practice of saying we need to have a profit margin. We need to be able to invest in ourselves and in you. That is to say, the economy at large, local communities, future proofing, so on and so forth. We need profit, and not to encourage their members to actually, they don't do that, do they? It's not that they encourage members to reduce profits in order to stay afloat. They just step back from commenting on it. They don't actually make a comment, and they just let it be an unanswered question. That for me is possibly the place where I'd want to see some sort of change, is actually taking a stance, being positive, being industry positive, and just insisting on the same simple basic premise that the people who employ development funded archaeologists, or rather, sorry, the people who certainly pay for development funded archaeology, insist on, and that is profit, profit, profit. We need profit if we're going to survive. And I don't know about you, though, even saying that as an archaeologist feels weird. It feels so strange. I don't know about you, but it feels so strange personally for my business when I'm doing workshops, or when I'm doing, for example, I've recently put in a bid for a project working with a local park, doing a history trail, which will involve graphic design, making video content, doing research, consulting on that back and forth, and then doing some attendant ongoing maintenance. I put in a bid. It's not even a bid; it's basically a quote. I'm almost guaranteed to get the job, but I feel bad doing it at a rate which isn't even actually particularly profitable, but at a rate which is making more, making money. I think we're encouraged as archaeologists, or rather, we're encouraged. We've been sort of trained, I think, to do it mainly for the love of it. And so long as archaeology is still happening, that's good enough. As long as some sort of heritage thing is occurring, then that's good enough. And one day the economy will be running hot again, and we'll all be able to make money in some particular way. But that's something we really need to combat. And I think it has to start, for example, hopefully with FAME. Making different statements. I'd love to see it. I really would. So,
look, I mean, as we're winding up, I think I would nuance it slightly differently to the way you just have.
Okay.
And that is that, again, I grew up in an environment where the first archaeology I did with professional archaeologists was with archaeologists employed by the government from the old Department of the Environment, who came in to support effectively a community dig from a local archaeological society that I was working on in the late 1970s. And they came in, and they didn't throw us off the site. They worked alongside us and mentored us. And it made a huge impact on me in terms of what can be done with professional archaeology working with people in the community. And crucially, as a public service, those Department of the Environment archaeologists came in almost like an ambulance service for archaeology that was about to be destroyed by as it happened, gravel digging. And so they came in to enable us to literally, it was rescue archaeology as it was then called, and it was a successful partnership. The work's been published. Look up the Icon Roman watermill. It's a significant site.
Okay.
And
I'll link below to something. Yeah, we'll see what we can find.
Yeah. But the point is that at that point, archaeology was seen as a public service. Now it's seen as a commercial adjunct, and I think if we can look, we know from the recent row between an organisation we haven't spoken about actually yet this afternoon, and we probably should have done earlier, which is the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, who are the membership body for most people who work professionally in archaeology, regardless of trade unions and so on. Their professional body, their standards body is CIFA. And we know from the problems that, say, FAME got into when it walked out from the industry working party on pay and conditions, and then subsequently when SEFA tried to do the same, SEFA's management tried to do the same under its previous chair, and then had to backtrack because of a revolt, literally a rebellion almost by the membership, who were wanting to pass votes of no confidence in the senior management of SEFA. But the members, a significant number of the members at least, want to see archaeology as more than just helping deliver commercial projects and profits for developers. There is probably a desire at least to have a debate about this among professional archaeologists. Now, whether they're going to be allowed to is another matter. As we've seen, SEFA's leadership has changed recently. There are signs that the new leadership, the new chair, the new chief, the new CEO, is more open and certainly more open to discussions. FAME have been very top down, and wanting to close down these kind of discussions. It can be alleged. So I think these things these are moving parts. What difference a new government will make, who knows? I mean, we're certainly not looking at any cash handouts anytime soon. Government's made that perfectly clear. So we'll see. Interesting times, as the alleged proverb goes.
I suppose, again, just the last thing I would say is I don't think you need more money to change the profit model from development. I think relationships have to be renegotiated, but potentially.
The money would have to come. The money I'm thinking about, and it's been mentioned by advocacy bodies like the Heritage Alliance and so on. And the government, to be fair, indirectly has started to address it. For example, by funding extra planning officers in local authorities, because one of the biggest problems that we're facing, not just our heritage planning, but planning in general, has been the lack of capacity within local authorities because they've been cut and cut and cut.
So that's been this week's watching brief. Hopefully you found this conversation stimulating and not too negative. I'm hopeful as ever. You have to be hopeful, I suppose. But I think the key has to be always having these conversations and being open to talking about where we are, what we're facing, and what's likely to have to change given what's on the horizon at any given point. And I suppose the only reason why at times I get very passionate about this stuff, and I pointed out recently this in other ways, but it is basically because my archaeological career has been defined by charitably stagnation, charitably speaking, if not actually a sort of managed decline that people are in a sort of denial about. And I'd much rather see that turned around, instead of people having to spin and change the outlook on the stats, actually change the attitude and change the expectation, and hopefully see real world change because of that. Any final comments from you, Andy?
Only that I mean, like you, we can seem to be very negative sometimes and very not particularly hopeful. What I would say is that from personal experience, talking to friends and colleagues in the sector, but also listening to the arguments like the recent argument about pay and conditions and whether SEFA should back away from setting minima and things like that. Not to mention just seeing the projects that are going on around the country. This sector is full of really talented, really committed people. Now, sometimes we might argue that certainly in the past, it's been a case of lions led by donkeys, to use that old and actually now rather discredited analogy with the First World War generals, British generals. And I think, you know, in terms of people's opinion and so on, we know that archaeology is full of generals. You know, the old joke, you know, put two archaeologists in a room and get three opinions. But, you know, we are part of
I think you get four opinions, actually.
Okay, well, anyway. You know,
that's my opinion.
Yeah, you're sticking. Yeah, was it the old Groucho Marx thing? Those are my principles, and if you don't like it, I've got others. Yeah, but look, no. In all seriousness, you know, there are so many good things and good people in our sector. You like to think that if there's any natural justice in the world, it will thrive in some form or another. It's just that sometimes we make life so difficult, sometimes even for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's to not making life overly difficult. Thank you so much for watching, folks at home. Thank you for your time as ever this week, Andy. If you like what you've seen here, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. So you can check out Andy's Ko-fi account, both of which are linked below. Consider buying Watching Brief merch, for example, the pin badges, which are available below, which hopefully we'll be adding to.
Baffled as to why you would ask that one.
Baffled. And ultimately as well, just add to the conversation. As I say, it's important to talk about this stuff, so please do comment below, and we'll see you next time. Until then, though, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.